So like a lot of the stuff that I teach at Fraser, like we really teach people to come into the body and really notice what's showing up for them, because that's where a lot of emotion shows up. That's where a lot of reactivity shows up. So if we can kind of get a little earlier in the trajectory, I don't know how this is showing up on the camera, but with my hands, but if we can kind of like capture it a little bit earlier in the trajectory of us getting,
Right.
reactive or getting stressed out, or, catch things a little bit earlier, then we're more likely to do that response that's a little more from aligned with our values and who we are inside.
Mhm. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, a practical podcast that guides clinical leaders and healthcare managers to create trust and support with their teams. I'm your host, Trace Hobson. Join me for weekly interviews, practical tools, and inspiring transformational stories of bringing people together in healthcare. Now, let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Safe Space Made Simple. Today, I have a really special guest who's coming on to talk to us about mindfulness-based stress reduction. Ron Plowright is a practitioner as well as an instructor in mindfulness-based stress reduction, and talks to us about how to actually implement this into a busy work environment, one step at a time. One of the things that I loved about this interview is that Ron makes it incredibly relatable and accessible for anybody to take steps into the world of mindfulness. And if you're like me and the people that I work with, a lot of the time, mindfulness can seem sort of this thing that is difficult to achieve, especially if you're like me who have a really busy mind and lots going on. In the interview, Ron talks about how that's actually not a barrier at all, and that if we can just take little steps, we can start to see the benefits and the payoffs very quickly. So if you're a busy manager, clinical leader, or an executive that's working in healthcare today, I think that this episode is going to really serve you. And Ron also includes resources that I'll include in the show notes as well. Now, without further ado, let's get right into the show. Ron Plowright, I'm so excited to have you on the show. Thank you for being here. I think to start off with, what would be great is if you could share the work that you do and who you are, and just kind of share with the audience a little bit about your work.
All right. Yeah. So my name is Ron Plowright. I work mostly with Fraser Health in the people development program as a client partner. And so we teach like lots of different leadership development courses, and we teach or facilitate, I guess is probably a better word, because it's not very didactic teaching per se. And then I'm also a coach. That part of my role for that team. So I do one-on-one coaching and a little bit of group coaching. Just recently got into some group coaching, and then like on the side, I teach mindfulness a little bit. So I'm certified to teach mindfulness-based stress reduction, and create my own curriculum on that front, and then do a little coaching on the side, and a little process facilitation if people need that kind of work, or if they need adult education around communication, or the same kind of very similar things that I teach at like leadership development type stuff that I teach at Fraser.
Cool. So that's a lot. Now, I want to focus in on mindfulness. Like, what
Yeah, sure.
got you into that work? Like, why did you decide that that was an important part? Do you have a bit of a background that you can share with us around that?
Yeah, for sure. Like many things for me, I kind of backed into it in some ways. Like, I mean, I'm kind of one of those people where it's like I wait for a bit of a sign, and then I kind of step into something, usually, rather than making some sort of a very heavily formulated plan. So yeah, one day I was working. It was, I think, 2 jobs ago, as a community health specialist, and I was on a committee around mental health, like in Chilliwack. And one day, this incredible person came in, named Dr. Shauna McPherson, and she was talking to us about creating mindful communities and how there's been this movement in the UK for that. And she'd recently been certified to teach MBSR, but she'd been a mindfulness practitioner and a Buddhist mindfulness practitioner for most of her adult life. And so one of the things was she was offering she wanted the sort of service providers in town to have the opportunity to take mindfulness-based stress reduction, to sort of spread that throughout the community. And so I was included in that crew. And yeah, so for like half price, I got to take MBSR. And then shortly after that, she also she was also starting. She wanted to start a graduate certificate in mindfulness-based teaching and learning at UFV at the University of Fraser Valley. So I she asked me to be on the steering committee for getting that going. And then as I was on the steering committee, much like I've had this happen to me before, I'm on the steering committee, and then I realized, oh, I really want to do this actually, not just I just want to talk about doing it or help other people do it. I want to do it myself. And so then I did the graduate certificate as well. I was in the first cohort. I was the only dude, which was pretty fun as well. And so yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah, so it was like a master's level coursework in mindfulness. So there was a lot of theory, but also it was also very practical. And UFE's kind of got a few programs like that where they're not only trying to give you sort of graduate level work or sort of academic work, but also some sort of accreditation or some sort of you walk away with some letters after your name or something like that that might help you. So we learned about curriculum development, learned about design, that kind of stuff, but also became equipped to teach mindfulness-based stress reduction through the Center for Mindfulness Studies in Toronto. So there's some connections there with Toronto too.
All right. So mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to speak from my perspective. When I first started hearing about mindfulness, it was a few years ago. And when I was a really busy executive leader and manager, quite frankly, I heard it and I was like, I don't have time for that. I don't take a deep breath is not going to be on my list of things to do. And so I'm curious about what you can share with us about why mindfulness is important for practical people and what does it actually do and what does it give you?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because there's the whole, what is mindfulness stuff, and there's there's different takes on where it comes from.
Maybe that's a good starting point. Like, what is mindfulness? Like, just a basic definition from your perspective.
I mean, like from that MBSR perspective, it's like John Kabat-Zinn was the the person who kind of got all that going, and I think that's really like paying attention like on purpose, paying attention basically to the present moment on purpose, and also bringing kind of a non-judgment and a kindness to how we how we show up in the present moment. So sort of, especially with ourselves. So there's sort of a non-judgment piece there. There's about paying attention, and there's the intention of being in the present as well. So there's sort of intention, attention, and the sort of way of being. One of them, one of them's non-judgment. There's many more, but that's the basics, right? It's just like, can I literally be in this moment and not be in the future, be in the past, be lost in thoughts, those kinds of things, being on autopilot. So it's like sort of the opposite of autopilot. And don't get me wrong, autopilot is an amazing thing that humans have. Like, what a beautiful thing that you can do all these things, or a person can do all these things without actually having to pay attention. That is kind of a really special thing that we have as well. But in the long run, it's not really great for you. It turns out that we can get in that rumination kind of space, and that's where a lot of depression is and those kinds of pieces. And also like not paying attention to sort of things like chronic disease or like chronic pain or these kinds of pieces, right? So when we're in the present, the lovely things that happen are, we cultivate a lot of mental health that way. It is as far as the data that I've read.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole piece around stress reduction and around like that's where a lot of the evidence is, because there's been MBSR has been studied so much compared to like other ways. Like previously it was like long-term meditators who were in studies, but most people aren't long-term meditators, but a lot of people can take an 8-week course and kind of get a sense of what's changed, and then follow up longitudinally. So I think what they've shown is that like really for helping anything around stress reduction, and then the chronic disease that can come from that chronic stress.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, what followed was MBCT, so mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and those folks have really proven over the years that we can use mindfulness in these 8-week courses to reduce depressive episodes, so like depressive relapse, basically, and on par with antidepressant medication. So that's a pretty neat neat thing. So like, again, it's not for everybody. And some folks do both, right? Both the medication and the mindfulness. But to know that there's another option out there that,
Mhm.
because a lot of people are kind of adverse to taking meds, right? So it's shown to be pretty effective there. So I think really it's about being in the present. And then when it comes to bringing it to work, I think it's like the ability to be with another person, to be present with another person. So there's the interpersonal piece as well. There's
Right.
a piece, I know what's showing up in me. I know what's showing up in my body. So like a lot of the stuff that I teach at Fraser, like we really teach people to come into the body and really notice what's showing up for them, because that's where a lot of emotion shows up. That's where a lot of reactivity shows up. So if we can kind of get a little earlier in the trajectory, I don't know how this is showing up on the camera, but with my hands, but if we can kind of like capture it a little bit earlier in the trajectory of us getting,
Right.
reactive or getting stressed out, or, catch things a little bit earlier, then we're more likely to do that kind of, that, you know, that response that's a little more from aligned with our values and who we are inside, rather
Mhm.
than reactive kind of knee jerk response that can come from reactivity. So,
Yeah, I
and
get
that's,
it.
that's
Like
the
this,
context I teach it in Fraser.
I like what you're saying there about getting that it earlier in the process, or like what's the signal? I remember when I first learned about being present and listening deeply and all of that, and it felt incredibly hard for me to do that. Even taking one deep breath felt
Hmm.
like an impossibility. It literally felt like
Yeah.
that as a busy manager and leader. But then to your point, as I was able to slow down and take that deep breath and start to practice that, I started to notice that I had all this information below my neck that I was ignoring or not a
Hmm.
conscious of. Like my gut was in knots, or
Right.
I had some tension in my legs, and those were signals. I learned
Absolutely.
after like many trial and error failures that that was actually a signal that I was getting to the point where I was dysregulated. And so I love what you're sharing there. And I'm curious, like when you started learning all this and you started to bring this into your own life and work, what was it like for you to start to practice this? Was it like easy? You just picked it up and ran with it? Or was there like what kinds of challenges did you encounter?
Yeah, one part that I didn't share with you is that like my first actual experiences with it, because I thought I could never do it. Like people say, I thought mindfulness was like you clear your mind, and I was like, didn't seem like that was
I
anywhere
can't do
near a
that.
possibility. Always got stuff going on. I've always got a song in there, like something that I picked up on the way. I'm like, or I'm humming something, or I heard one word and I remember some song from the 80s or 90s, and I start singing it in my mind. Like my brain is always going. And so I took this course that we offer at Fraser, called Clear Leadership, and I took it about 12 years ago for the first time, and I took it twice with them. Now I have um, the very big honor of teaching it to others. But there's a piece of it called attention to sensation, and essentially it's a 10-minute body meditation, like attention to physical sensations of the body.
Mhm.
But basically before it was like, set a timer, go. Okay, you're just going to pay attention to what's showing up in the body and go. And I called it attention to palpitation, because all I could feel was my heartbeat, and I was like, what's going on here? And I
Right.
just realized how unsettled I was, and I didn't really
Right.
realize before. Or like I knew I'd been diagnosed with anxiety when I was quite a young, quite not young, but like in my like 19, 20, I think. And so I knew that
Mhm.
I was a bit unsettled, and I knew that I had that symptom when I was a younger guy. Um, but I'd kind of like, I'd done my meds and I'd done my whole thing, and I'd gotten weaned off and all that. And I'd felt like I really, after I actually took myself out of, or got through university and everything, I realized, okay, like for the most part, I can really work with this. I can do that sort of CBT stuff, and keep this at bay. So I didn't really feel like I had anxiety anymore. But then
Mhm.
here I was paying attention and going, oh, I've got this. My body, like you were saying, kind of, I'm going to paraphrase, but like huge source of data. And it was telling me that. And I'm like, this can't be right. This can't be like, am I not supposed to be relaxing, or something? Isn't this supposed to be calming or something? And here I am like paying
Right.
attention to this thing. And so I just thought I couldn't do it.
Mhm.
And so it took me a lot of years to come back to it. So now you can, I hope you can imagine, like when I teach from the perspective of like, okay, like I teach beginners mostly, and I really love to teach beginners. And because I don't have like that kind of acumen of like somebody who's been practicing themselves for like decades or something. So I
Mm,
always just tell people I'm no guru. Like I've got some wisdom. I've got some stuff that I've learned along the way, and I think I'm a decent educator, but I'm no guru. So like I'm a person and I am a work in progress, and I'm learning as I go here, and I'm going to learn with you basically, whether I'm coaching you or
mhm,
I'm doing leadership development stuff. But same with mindfulness. I mean, like I'm trying to pay attention to what's showing up in this moment between you and me and myself, around what's going on around us. And and sometimes it's harder, way harder than others. And sometimes the
mhm.
stuff that shows up isn't pleasant. And so it's like it's not that
Yeah.
mindfulness isn't some like lovely, roses and and rainbows all the time, right? Like sometimes what if you're paying attention to what's in the here and now, sometimes what's in the here and now really sucks. Like it's really
Mhm.
terrible, actually. And so it's learning how to be with what's here right now, right? And so
Right.
we also teach this piece called the window of tolerance, which is sort of like sometimes when we're paying attention to the here and now, what's showing up, sometimes that can be overwhelming. We can get overwhelming urges, we can get overwhelming images, right? So thinking about trauma informed perspective, but also just thinking about anybody could, get into that fight or flight response or that freeze response. So it's paying attention to when we flip into that, because then I would say, okay, sometimes avoidance is actually pretty good. When I'm teaching mindfulness, I'm teaching people to stay with what's present.
Mhm.
But if what's present is now moving into that sympathetic nervous system response, then I kind of say, okay, we're trying to find that sweet spot between self care and self challenge.
Yeah, I
And
like
if
what
we
you're
flip,
sharing there.
yeah, yeah,
So one of the things that comes up for me as you're talking is how there's a sense of, well, first of all, I just thank you for sharing that around your anxiety, because I think that that's not something that we're used to talking about. And one of the things
mm,
that I'm trying to get better at is talking about my own anxiety, and the fact that I also was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder as well as PTSD, complex
right,
PTSD. And that requires or invites me into a practice of presence and mindfulness so that I can begin to do the work inside that I need to, so that I can heal. And I think that that's a really important component that I've discovered. And I'm curious about that for you too. As you're in those spaces for you as a practitioner, as a instructor, and also then guiding others, one of the things that I've noticed is if you can generate a space where people feel safe enough to actually become present and be
mhm,
mindful, there's a natural thing that happens that I notice where there's opportunities that come up, things show up, the emotions show up, the different things that maybe I've been carrying for a long time start to show up.
mm,
And there's an opportunity to be present with that and have co-regulation and self-regulation that brings healing. And I really have noticed how healing it's been for me during times when I've been around people that can do what we're talking about with me, and sometimes even on my behalf, in a
mhm.
space that's um safe so that I could heal. And I'm curious, like, have you discovered anything around that? And if so, what have been your experiences?
Yeah. I mean, so much. And, like I was sort of saying earlier, some of it I backed into, some of it I had no idea I was creating a safe space, but it was happening. Sometimes, it's learning when people didn't feel safe, either at home or when I'm practicing or when I'm practicing, or when I'm teaching, I have actually accidentally, triggered people. I have accidentally, all these kinds of things. And so there's been definitely trials and tribulations. I think I've even been in a course with you where I don't think I necessarily triggered anybody, but definitely made mistakes, right? Like where I think I was in a course with you where I said to everybody, because we're all the system, right? I remember that, and like just the whole room went silent, and a few people were like, ah, and I'm like, okay, that had an impact that I wasn't intending.
Hmm.
And so like just having to kind of go, okay, that, clearly that's not something that everybody in this class feels. So I think this sort of, there's pieces that I've learned through making mistakes. um Thankfully they weren't terrible mistakes, and nobody got hurt, but where people didn't feel safe enough to say they weren't safe, which is also which is also very helpful too. But I think for the most part, what I've learned is that first little bit when you're together
Yeah.
is really crucial, really
Yeah.
crucial.
I
Yeah.
love what
So
you're
it's really
sharing about
setting
there.
it up. Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that up,
Yeah.
because I think that it's interesting to me, your perception of that moment you're talking about, because what I hear, and even when you share the story now, is you were present enough to notice something happened.
Mhm.
I remember a time for me when I would not have been present enough to
Yeah.
notice. I would have been like oblivious, and then people would tell me afterwards, and I might be a bit defensive. But you in that moment were actually sensitive to what was happening, and then to have the ability to actually own it in the moment too. I really admired the way that you did that, and that's, I think, a key to generating a safe space too. For trauma
I had
informed
help
practice.
too, just so
Well,
you
I mean,
know.
right? Like you,
Yeah.
even in Daniel Siegel's work with a window of tolerance, one of the things I love about that tool is when you look at the window of tolerance in the actual handout in the margin, there's mention of a co-regulative partner. Have somebody do this with you, and
Mhm.
then it's way easier. So yeah, we need each other, right? Like, I mean, I guess that shouldn't be surprising, but we actually need relationships that are safe, that support us, that allow us to make mistakes at times, because we're
Mhm.
all going to make mistakes. And that doesn't have to be a negative thing. Like maybe I've made it in the past. It can be a really positive thing that takes us deeper, right?
Yeah.
To deeper relationship. The other thing I think of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with David Treleaven's work in trauma-informed meditation, but I really
Absolutely.
love his work because he makes it really accessible for anybody who has experienced trauma in the past.
Absolutely.
And to, like, there's skills and tools, keep your eyes open, stay in the moment, be connected
Yeah.
to your body, all of those different things. And it is possible to do mindfulness no matter what your background has been or what sort of things you've gone through, as
Yeah.
long as you have a safe space and you have guidance and support to be able to do that, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
are you familiar with David's work?
I would really recommend his, yeah. And like, I think I would really recommend that book, Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. Or even if you can just like get a Cole's Notes kind of version of it, like, what, 'cause he's sort of got a top 10. Yeah. Like you said, give more choice. I think
Yeah.
that's huge. Right. And I think the beautiful thing about learning for me about trauma informed mindfulness or trauma sensitive mindfulness was that I was able to apply it to when I'm working with a whole room, even if we're not doing mindfulness. Like a lot of the stuff, like I apply window of tolerance now because I learned that through trauma informed mindfulness, but I can apply window of tolerance to when I'm working with a group. I don't have to be doing mindfulness practices. And I can tell people, and I learned about that sort of self-care versus self-challenge from my group, from Dr. McPherson. This idea that, you don't have to tough it out. And that's a Dave Treleaven thing too, is like, you don't have to tough it out. You don't have to, it's not like you don't have to listen to the guidance of the person who's doing the guiding, right? So I'm very clear about that. Like I even use language like tell me to F off or something, or in your mind or whatever. Like if it, you don't have to do what I say, right? This is all
Mm,
invitational. Like I'm very clear that, the language is invitational, and we use present moment focused language as well, like lots of ing words, like present participles and that kind of stuff. So people are staying in the moment. And if
mm,
those overwhelming images and urges come up, yeah, open the eyes if you had them closed. But yeah, we give people more options for trauma sensitive mindfulness. We want to give them options. If laying down doesn't feel right, like that's a very vulnerable position to be laying on your
yeah.
back to do a body scan, right? But that's the traditional way of like teaching body scan or guiding for body scan. But crap, like do it seated, to do it standing up, like whatever it takes to make you feel
Mhm.
safe enough that you're good enough to do it, right? So give people options around opening eyes or sorry, eyes closed, or like a sort of unfocused gaze, downcast a few feet in front of you is how I call it out
Mm,
when I'm guiding, right? So I just then, and I've actually had that be like a total game changer for people. Like, and they say, yeah, I opened my eyes this time and I actually could meditate. Whereas for me, I have a really difficult time with all that data coming in, uh, with my eyes open to actually meditate on the body. I can do
mm.
like a visual, like I can do a seeing meditation with my eyes open, obviously, but it's but harder to do that. Yeah. So I think those are big. I think really teaching the window of tolerance is huge, and some of the ways to return, right? So yeah, like having another person is wonderful, but also just like naming five things in the room. That's a really common one for either things you can see or five things you can, you can use all the senses too, like what you can hear or those kinds of pieces. That can be very grounding for people. Feeling the feet on the floor, the hands have so many nerve endings too, so just can bring us back to the present and out of those overwhelming things that are happening in the mind. It's just what you got to be clear with there is, I think, for me, it's really helpful to have another person. I sometimes I teach alone and or I facilitate alone, and I think it's okay. But if you're going to have a group of like say 10, 20 people, then I start to think, man, really having a second or third is pretty important too. And that's to help keep me safe too. Like when that thing happened, when I said the system thing, it was actually Carrie and Elder Emily who took me aside and said, hey, I don't think that really landed, right? And so I noticed a shift and I was like, oh, and I did get a bit defensive. You said, I just sort of like, oh gosh, like I didn't mean, right? Because that wasn't what I intended, right? That whole defensiveness that comes from impact versus intent. But then I was able to kind of have that chat with them and have them ground me a bit and go, okay, now's my chance to take responsibility for that impact, and then turn around and, in a short period of time, do that repair. And I think that that's also a helpful lesson for me, is just that having other people around me. And I also, one of my favorite interviews of all time, I think it was Treleaven. He had a podcast as well, and he was interviewing Resmaa Menakem. And I don't know if your listeners know Resmaa, but his writings are some of the most amazing books that I've ever read. And so My Grandmother's Hands particularly is my fave. And he also teaches this. And when he's doing a guiding a meditation, he has you at the end of it. And I use this every time now. At the end of it, have you look behind yourself around this way, and then take in the whole room and look behind yourself around this shoulder as well. And it's just that situating of the body. And there's something about knowing what's behind you that also is settling. Right. And I think that's also really trauma informed as well, is knowing, like, even in some of his books, he talks about like knowing where your exits are and all these kinds of things. Because especially people with CPTSD, like you're saying for yourself, if there's blocked exits, or if there's, places where people feel they're stuck or they can't escape, or those kinds of pieces. And even if they don't cognitively know it, their system still knows it somewhere in there, right? So how can we make it set up so that the people systems feel,
yeah, I love this,
even if they cognitively feel okay?
Hey, just a quick pause to today's podcast. Are you having a challenge as a clinical leader with one or more individuals who you find activate you on your team? Or maybe you're noticing that oftentimes you want to be able to communicate with people, but in the heat of the moment, it's difficult for you because you're having a difficult time regulating yourself. Well, I totally understand this. This has been some of the biggest challenges in my life as a leader and as a human being. And so I created a free resource for clinical leaders, nurse educators, and healthcare executives called the Relationship Regulator. It's a mini course that will show you step by step a framework that may serve you very powerfully in this area. So if you want to download the Relationship Regulator for free, click in the show notes and you'll find that resource for you today. Now, back to the show. One of the things that I noticed years and years ago, I call it the cowboy stance. And when I used to go to bars or any kind of situation, right, without being consciously aware of it until many years later, I would know where all the exits were. I would be in the corner of the room, surveying the entire room at all times, looking for signals of threat or signals of safety. But, that stance is like, I probably spent the first 36 to 38 years of my life like that, maybe 35 years of my life like that. So I totally get that. And a safe space like you're talking about, so important. And I'm curious what you think about the contrast of that, because when, where I come from in the operational world that I come from and some of the 24/7 operations I was a part of, the culture is like a culture of anxiety and urgency and being busy and rushed. And what I realized about that was that I never felt safe, and neither did any of the people that were working in that. Even though oftentimes we would even talk about safety, occupational health and safety, et cetera, we'd be talking about it and not feeling it. And that had a huge impact. And so I'm curious, as we're, working, this podcast is designed for leaders that are working in a really busy healthcare system. And so what kinds of things would you invite those managers and leaders that are in the real thick of it to consider about how to actually do this in real time, and how to start to implement it in their day-to-day, week-to-week practice as managers and leaders?
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good question, man. I think one thing I wanted to mention about that interview between David Treleaven and Resmaa Menakem was that um, Resmaa Menakem said the most amazing gift, something I'm going to paraphrase it, probably muck it up, but the most amazing gift you can give another person is a settled body.
Hmm.
And I never even sort of thought of that. And it's just, there's something about being with a person who's settled and being with another calm presence that really is a game changer for folks. And so even if you're one person who's in the middle of that busy, wacky ER or ICU or whatever corporate situation you're in, you're not, it's there's a bit of a tension there because you want to still show urgency. You still want to show that if there's something's emergent, you want to be there with folks. And sometimes you need to take that stance of like being directive or, those kinds of pieces where it's less, sometimes the relational and the directive kind of, the balance changes a little bit depending on the situation. Mm-hmm. And people are looking for sometimes, pretty solid, directives in some of those contexts from a leader. But for the most part, I think if you can show up with that settled body and, show up with the calmness and, be the person who has that good, like decent space between stimulus and response, I think that can go like miles. Like I think when people are, and even if you show up that way most of the time, but then sometimes, sometimes you get reactive, then people aren't thinking, oh, Ron's a jerk. They're thinking, hey, I wonder what's up with Ron. He's usually not reactive, or he's usually not, he's usually not anxious, or he's not that kind of thing. So something must be going on. So someone's thinking more like something's going on versus this person's always shows up this way. And so I think that goes a long, long way. I think that if we can set that tone as a leader, even if it's having, a 2 mindful minutes at the beginning of a huddle or at the beginning of a staff meeting or a team meeting, whether that's encouraging people when you see somebody that's getting to know the signs of somebody who's getting outside of their window of tolerance, and having people look for it in each other and just kind of take that person aside and say, what do you need right now? What can I do? How can I help you? And not something that's going to be like, what's wrong with you? Or like, I noticed something's wrong with you, because that can actually be activating as well. But just like, hey, is there anything I can do for you right now? What, how might I help you, or whatever the case may be. And then I think a lot of it as a leader is actually like, is sort of like leading by example. So I think self-care, I think, in support of self-care. And I think, showing people that it's okay to say, hey, I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed right now, and actually just naming it. And before you're over the edge, and just sort of saying, I'm noticing I'm getting a bit overwhelmed. I'm going to take a bit of a walk. I'll come back in 5 minutes and we can continue the conversation. Just feeling a little bit overwhelmed.
I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because one of the things as you're talking, I'm thinking about the earlier version of me, or people that like are going, yeah, okay. I get that mindfulness is important. I get that I need to do it and set an example. And so what does that actually mean? And one of the things that I noticed is that even being aware of the fact that I am activated and reactive internally is actually a step in the right direction. And then the action that I can take with that is exactly what you just said, which is to just name it, to just say, you know what, right now I am feeling activated, and I need a minute. And to give yourself what you need and want in that moment is so pivotal to be able to then build more capacity between the stimulus and the response, between what's happening, to get that window a little wider so that you can actually respond in a different way and be in the eye of the storm. But when I think back to how it first started for me, it was really like just being aware of what was going on here inside of me, and then beginning to acknowledge that and talk about that openly with everybody, and just to share 100%. That, which at first felt terrifying for me, I'll be honest, because I did not want to, I'm the leader. I'm supposed to know everything, have all the answers, and never sweat, right? That's, I think, a lie that I used to buy into. And I I oftentimes encourage leaders to go, no, actually, that's an old form of leadership that's hierarchical that doesn't work anymore. What we need now in complexity is relationship, connection, self-regulation, and co-regulation. We need to develop systems that support us to navigate this complexity, because otherwise we're not going to change what's going on, and some of the negative things that are happening in our healthcare system across the country and even around the world. So, yeah, I love what you're sharing there, man. And so, what are a couple of really practical things that people could do, like a couple of steps that they could take to start to just dabble or tip their toe in the water, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, there's a few things, like understanding the window of tolerance, I think is helpful. Doing, 5, 10 minute, well, 10 minutes is sort of the, not the minimum, but in terms of having the positive outcomes, but sitting with the body or with the breath for 10 minutes a day, whether that's, a very formal practice or whether that's more informal, because a lot of people find different ways into mindfulness. Some folks, the formal does work, like the actually doing a sit or doing a movement practice of some kind, like a mindful yoga or something, is the way in. For others, it's like kind of little bits at a time, like being more mindful as I'm brushing my teeth or as I'm eating or as I'm going up the stairs, or stopping for a few breaths throughout the day. Yes, just if you can have something that jogs the brain to take a minute, to just notice the body, notice the feet on the floor. We Fraser Health contracts with a company called Mind Well You, and they have this thing called Take Five, which is kind of a lovely piece. And it's like, you take 5 breaths, you notice the feet on the floor, you look around, notice something novel in your space. And you don't have, nobody has to know you're doing it, right? Like that's the beauty of it, right? So you can do these informal practices throughout the day. A lot of times I'll stop and something will trigger the stopping. Like I'll have a cue that tells me to stop, and I'll notice my shoulders are tense, or I'll notice I'm actually like my glasses are starting to fall down. So I'm actually doing something with my face to hold my glasses in place, but it's giving me a headache. And so I kind of realize, oh gosh, if I just do this and I just relax my face, oh man, I already feel 4 times better than I did like a few seconds previously. Oh, my shoulders are tense. Okay, just soften that area. So that's a huge part, is sort of bringing some of that informal in, starting with a very short formal practice every day, 5, 10 minutes. I always say, like, 10 minutes is great, half an hour, an hour is great, but 5 minutes is better than zero. 2 minutes is better than zero. So whatever you can, just take that time to be in the present moment, notice what's showing up. But so the longer you can actually do those kinds of practices where you're learning to be with the difficulty, so either introduce a difficulty or notice, in your posture, oh gosh, my back's starting to hurt. But I think it's those practices that help us widen the window of tolerance, so that when we get into those situations where we're actually about almost activated in real life, we actually have noticed, oh, I can actually hang out in this space a little bit longer than last time, and a little bit longer than last time, until that window is just big enough now where I've got that moment. I've got a pretty sizable chunk between stimulus and response, and now I can really do something like really aligned with my values. I think an exercise I did with you folks at Creating the Fire Within is the circle of awareness. We do it in MBSR as well. And it's just, picking a stressor and then kind of walking, like picking a stressful situation that you had just recently been through, and kind of walking back what happened before. Like when you realize you were sort of stressed, you'd kind of gone into fight or flight, basically. Okay, so can you walk it back? What happened before that? Okay, what happened before that? What did you notice? Oh, I noticed this. Okay, what did you notice? What did you say? Oh, I did this. Or what were your behaviors? Or what emotion were you feeling? And you can keep walking it back, and we put the emotions on one part, and we put the behaviors and urges on one part, and we put the thoughts we had in one part, right? And we kind of have people make this like messy step by step of all the things that showed up before they realized, they were, before they actually started yelling, or whatever the case may be, or stormed out of the room, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And so understanding that trajectory, and like if you do that 5 or 10 times, like do that same exercise 5 or 10 times, you might start to realize, oh man, I have tells. I have I have these things that I do every time, or that my body does, or that my system does every time. And so now, next time, maybe I notice this one, and then the time before that, I notice the one before that, and then the next time I notice the one before that, and pretty soon it's like, for me, my earlobes get hot. I don't know what that's all about. They get red and hot. I don't know who that's fight or flighting against. It's not helping me run away, and it's not helping me fight anybody, but it is giving me a message.
Yeah.
So when I have that message now, I go, oh, right, I'm about to go there, but I have the chance now to have a different, outcome. Now I'm in choice, and so now I can be choiceful a little earlier than I was before, or a little earlier than I was before. And like I said, I'm no guru, no expert, and it's a lot easier at work for me than it is at home. I'll be honest, but when I notice that, now I can do something about it. And so I just having people like do that piece to get ahead of things in the trajectory, I think as a leader, especially, like if you can get there before the reactivity comes, that can
I
be,
like what you're sharing about
huge.
Consistent practice, because I know one of the places that I used to do early days, like 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, work my way up, was in the bathroom. I literally that was my place. I would just, because it's when you're in a busy environment, sometimes there's like nowhere you can go where there isn't people. Well, that's the one place that I can go where there isn't anybody else, or a closet I can find somewhere in a hallway somewhere, just step in, take 60 seconds and then step out. I mean, if I've got an office, that's great. I can use that, but some people don't have that. Right. So, I'm also thinking it would be great, Ron, if you could give us a bit of a list of some of the resources you mentioned, and I'll include those in the show notes as well.
Oh, sure.
So maybe we'll talk about that afterwards. But so just so you know, as you're listening to this, there'll be some links down below that you can go to that will also be there, so you can explore some of the things that Ron's brought up. Now, Ron, just bring things to a close. Where can people get in touch with you, and how can they get in touch with you if they have more questions or they'd like to do some work with you?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is through LinkedIn. I think it's probably the best. I'm part of a mindfulness teachers cooperative as well. We have a website, but I think probably just my name, Ron Plowright, Plowright on LinkedIn. The caveat is that my cousin is a realtor, has exactly the same name. We're both named after my grandpa. So if you'd see anything about being a realtor, it's not
okay.
me.
Ron doesn't sell real estate, everyone.
The other Ron is a lovely guy, and if you do need a realtor, he's a guy. He's a great guy, but I don't do that. So yeah, but if you're just looking for me online,
that'd be actually a pretty good spin. You could be the mindfulness realtor. Maybe you should get together. No,
we can go into it together. Yeah.
No, we'll include your link.
To
we'll include your link down below too. So we've got the LinkedIn link as well. Perfect. Ron, thank you so much for your time and for the work that you're doing out there. I really appreciate you and the work you're doing. Thank you.
And likewise, it's always lovely to hang out with you and to chat with you, and yeah, to get to do it in front of other people today was fun too. But hope we get to hang out again soon.
Yeah, we will. Thanks, man. All right, that's the end of our show. Thank you so much for listening and supporting our podcast. The intention of this podcast is to amplify a positive message in healthcare, and also to share resources that will help really busy managers, clinical leaders, and executives to generate a safe space. I trust that today's podcast has done just that. And remember, as you leave here, be a safe space, especially for yourself. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you again for getting to the end of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this and you found that there was value in it for you, my invitation is for you to subscribe for future episodes that come out weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being with you next time. Now remember to be a safe space.